Welcome back, everyone. I have the pleasure of already knowing our next speaker, having met her in July. Her name is Dr. Gabriella Beckles Raymond, and she has over 20 years national and international experience in education. Gabby is an interdisciplinary philosopher, educator, writer, and strategic consultant, and has a wealth of information to impart on us all. Hi, Gabby, how are you today?
Hi, how you doing? Happy to be here.
Brilliant, it's lovely to see you again. Okay, so thank you.
Let me get my screen up here. Can you all see that? It's always nervous having a PowerPoint. Right, there we go. All right, okay, good stuff. Well, thank you for having me, and just thank you, Steve and the Oasis family, for giving me the opportunity to write this report about transformational initial teacher training. And I'm really happy to share with you some of the insights from that report today, but equally important, as we've all talked about, to really make some concrete suggestions that we can implement to really break the cycle. And so I wanted to say that while the focus of the report is on initial teacher training, the information and the implications are applicable across the whole education sector. So I think there's something for everyone here today, hopefully. Before I begin, though, I'd like to preface what I share with you with a couple of thoughts that I think are needed to be said to kind of ground the conversation. I'm sure some of you are thinking, like, do we really need another report about racism in education? And I must confess, I had that same feeling myself when I embarked on the task. But I think that there's something, or I hope that I've offered something in the report that really makes it unlike others, in the sense that it offers insights that will get us thinking and talking and responding to intersectional injustice within education in a very different way. And yet I'm also very much aware that the very nature of report writing and professional conferences and events like these, in some sense, create a kind of setting that undermines the progress that we want to make. And what I mean by that is that when you look at data, as a report inevitably must do, we kind of sanitize the issues that we need to tackle. So it's kind of analogous to giving a body count of soldiers lost in a war instead of walking the terrain in the grime and the terror and the blood of where that battle ensued. And in discussing the former, we can be professional and abstract, but if, you know, the data and the numbers, but if we really walk that terrain, walk in those soldiers' shoes, just as we really want to grapple with structural intersectional racism in education, we cannot speak of these issues without experiencing a whole host of difficult emotions: anger, hurt, fear, shame, guilt, frustration, whatever it is. But it's in that space of vulnerability that we can draw strength in hope and faith and courage and moral indignance that transforms a mission from something academic and professional to something really life-affirming for all of us who care about the liberatory power of education. And so indeed, in a sense, what I wanted to say, if that you don't feel anything like that, I don't think we've yet touched at the heart of the matter. And so once you've read the report, as I hope you'll do once you've left the conference, or if you've had a chance to skim it, and there'll be information later about where you can access the report, I really encourage you to grapple with the contents of the report as you would sit around your kitchen table with your loved ones, and embrace the grime and the hurt and the mess, because it's that process that this report and all the other decades of work it builds on has a chance of being really transformative. So let's get messy. Right, so I'm going to kind of do my little piece in two brief sections. The first section is really just to give a very quick overview of some of the main findings of the report. I don't want to belabor those points because I think, like I say, you can read that information in your own time. And more importantly, we want to get to the actual structural things to do at the end that we want to get from this session. And so that will form the second part. So pardon me if I'm rushing through, but I want to get to the juice of things. So the rationale for the report is there's a kind of nationally widespread recognition that we need to increase the number of African, Caribbean, and Asian teachers at all levels. And we also have a conversation about race in education, but it doesn't really attend to ITT provision. So we see it discussed, as in this case, in the Breaking the Cycle conference, and we hear discussions about issues for Black and BME students and, and the like. But that conversation about race in education really doesn't touch initial teacher training. And similarly, there's a conversation about initial teacher training provision, but that conversation doesn't attend to racism and intersectional justice. So part of the aim of this report was really to bring those two conversations together. Because obviously how our teachers are trained, what they learn, what they're taught to teach, the values that they're taught to instill ultimately impacts what education looks like. And so the aims of the report then were firstly to provide a targeted overview of ITT provision so we can see what the landscape looks like. Secondly, to highlight how existing ITT provision maintains racism and intersectional justice, and really to introduce a new framework for evaluating interventions to improve IT provision. And like I said, really by extension, this is applicable to the sector, and identify transformative principles. And so I think the second section of this report, which I'm going to touch on less, but which my recommendations fall out of, is really a tool to enable us to determine, well, what interventions do we need and are they effective, so that we're not lost in the dark and wasting time and resources when we're attempting to tackle these complex questions. And so the three elements of the report look at recruitment, training, and retention. And so in the recruitment in the context of initial teacher training, the issue is really that there are issues that are unseen. And so one of the first things that became immediately apparent is that the traditions of African, Caribbean, and Asian peoples and community traditions around learning, many of which Professor Fenton has alluded to earlier, really are ignored when we're talking about questioning the pipeline to teacher training. There's an incredible history of within these communities of a commitment to education, whether that's in supplementary schools, whether that's in independent schools that have been set up within those communities, whether it's the amount of time and dedication dedicated to personal tutoring of children, and all these things never get discussed when we are raising the question of, why are we seeing this lack of African, Caribbean, and Asian teachers. And so it's important to begin with that premise that there really is a value for education within these communities, and raise the question, why is that not translating into an interest in teaching? And so one of the questions in recruitment is that government really takes a colorblind approach to initial teacher training recruitment. There's a kind of blanket approach to how do we attract students, which really doesn't tap into or provide targeted solutions for those communities to address the deficit that we're all kind of aware of. Another issue is that, and this is an issue for absolutely everyone, but the complexity, and this has been recognized, I think, nationally now, the complexity of the ITT process is just absolutely unnecessary and makes it difficult for anyone to get into teaching. But the number of different junctures within that process, what we found in the research is that there's discrimination at every single phase. So literally the more phases you have, the less and less applicants from those communities you get in coming through that pipeline. So there's really a practical need to address the manner in which ITT recruitment and application process is handled. I think fourthly, also, there's a question about the knowledge and experience of racism in education of people from those communities prior to entering into initial teacher training, both on the positive end and on the negative. And I think one of the things that we often forget for those of us who are involved in education is that people who are in education tend to have had a great experience of education. It's a place of joy or fulfillment or a sense of accomplishment that we experience in our formative years. And there's a question that if that is not your experience, education is not going to be a setting to which you're very eager to return. And so the questions around the pipeline, as the Mayor mentioned and Professor Kenton mentioned earlier, I think are really significant and need to be brought into that conversation, because if we are to get more African, Caribbean, and Asian teachers within the system, we have to create a system that provides a positive, enriching, formative educational experience. In the context of training, the primary theme was just a real silencing about racism and intersectional injustice in ITT at multiple levels. So I'll just name a few here, just as a taster. So there was silence about addressing intersectional racism in developing best ITT practice, right? So when we're talking about, well, what does good ITT look like? There's really no conversation about intersectional justice and racism within that discussion. And so a real lack of recognition that that's even an issue within that context. There's also silence about intersectional racism in ITT delivery. So one of the primary issues that we found in the research and in the reports is that many teacher trainers from African, Caribbean, and Asian communities are dropping out or are leaving their programs on account of the discrimination they experience both in the university setting and in the school placement settings. So there's, again, questions around how is ITT delivered, in addition to those questions about curriculum and pedagogical approaches and other issues. So there's a real need to put the conversation about intersectional racism in ITT, on the map. There's also a really important consideration, I think, and again, this I think goes beyond ITT, is that there's a dilemma around silence and success. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, we really don't have a lot of examples or have failed to celebrate the successes of African, Caribbean, and Asian people within ITT and in teaching more broadly. But there's this dilemma that when we celebrate those successes, that celebration and that recognition of those people who've done incredible work and made it against the odds, people like Marvin and Professor Fenton, as we've seen, it then can also have the effect of masking the very institutional racism that makes these stories success stories in some sense in the beginning. And so I just really wanted to flag up the challenge of that dilemma, getting the balance of, celebrating and recognizing and honoring those people who've done an incredible job, but also making sure we keep our eye on the institutional systemic obstacles that people from these communities face. In the context of retention, there's a whole host of issues, but a lot that revolve around how we understand retention itself, how we define it, how we measure it, and how we look at it. And this kind of framing makes it very difficult to identify the challenges that African, Caribbean, and Asian teacher trainees face. So one of the issues is that ITT retention is not monitored nationally or transparently. So individual institutions or programs might keep their own internal records, but there is not a national kind of data set that we can access to really see, break down those demographics of who's dropping out and why. Then ITT itself falls outside of the retention in teaching and education discussions. So we see discussions around teacher retention, like in this case, in the Break the Cycle, questions about teacher progression, and teachers dropping out once they're qualified in teaching, leaving early. But typically there's no conversation about African, Caribbean, and Asian teacher trainees dropping out from ITT itself before they even get into the teaching profession. And so again, there's a need to put that in the discussion. And then there's a real need, I think, what the report found, to really understand progression as a retention issue. So again, we've got a conversation about, professional progression and the barriers that those communities face to promotions, etc., but not framed as a retention issue. And the reality is, if I'm a talented, capable, skilled, professional, I'm not going to stay around in a job where there's no opportunity for me to grow and progress. Right. And so it's not just a question of progression, it's also that progression needs to be understood as a retention question. And finally, and for me, in some ways, perhaps most importantly, is that it is, and we've heard this kind of repeated in different ways today, that it's crucial that we understand retention, teacher retention, as intersectional and operating in multiple and complex ways. And so one of the question issues, again, around retention is that in all the national data sets across different elements of education, none of them allow or permit for a really genuinely intersectional analysis. And what I mean by that is that as a educational leader, as a teacher, or whatever your particular role is, you really can't look at the data and see where gender is intersecting with race, or where class is intersecting with race or disability or any of the other identity protected characteristics, such that we can get a much more nuanced and complex picture. And that's crucial because the experiences, well, number one, teaching, we know, is the kind of has gender disparities in the sense that there are more women in teaching. But just because there are more women in teaching doesn't mean that they necessarily have a better experience. We know there's a lack of women at senior leadership levels, for example. And so we really need the data to be able to reflect an intersectional picture so that we can make our efforts much more targeted in that way. And so I just got on the screen just a quick slide, and this is in the report so you can peruse it at your own time, but this is a kind of image of a journey from education through application to ITT training and out the other side when you become a qualified teacher. And what you'll see on this table is that the two blue dots, these are the places where retention is discussed. And specifically with regard to African, Caribbean, and Asian groups, but all the other junctures on the picture, whether it's the application process, and someone asked a question about that earlier, and what the data shows is that people from those communities' applications get dismissed or not accepted at far higher rates than their white counterparts. So there are issues about retention along every juncture of the teacher training process, none of which enter in the discussion about retention. So again, we need to at least recognize and name the issues that are on the table. And so let me get more now to some structural, because ultimately we want the things to do list. And I'm going to focus on the structural things to do because my panel members are going to address some of the issues at the operational and policy level. And so structurally, what can we do? Well, firstly, I think it is crucial that we must understand the nature and the magnitude of the issue. And again, the mayor has rightly kind of outlined some of these things, but this is a historic, endemic, structural, the question of intersectional racism that affects every element and aspect of our society, whether it's politics, education, culture, so on and so on. And so within the educational context, we have to recognize how ubiquitous the problem of intersectional justice is, such that we don't just take it as a kind of superficial question that we can dust off with a couple of work trainings and, you know, a nice inset day. And so one of the issues here is that there's a real glaring lack of educational professionals who are equipped to develop intersectionally just ITT or classroom lessons. There's a lack of people who are comfortable and knowledgeable about the terminology, strategic approaches, and best practices to move this forward. And so the first thing we need to do is recognize the need for a really long-term plan to upskill the sector. And one of the ways in which we need to do that is really to look and respect the decades of work and experience done by African, Caribbean, and Asian scholars, educators, writers, speaking and making documentaries and cultural outputs, all that grapple with these issues of intersectional racism and developing solutions, you know, within the education sector and beyond. So we really need to educate ourselves actually with the information that is out there and available. The second thing we must do is own the issue and address our own worldview. So the bottom line is that there's no such thing as a level playing field. It just doesn't exist, not in Britain and not globally. There's no such thing. And the reality, the harsh reality, is that education is one of the primary vehicles for producing racism, for producing prejudice. If we understand that no human is born with any of these kinds of prejudices, it raises the question, you know, well, how do we get these kinds of attitudes and these systems and these power structures that we're a part of? And education is very much responsible for that. The good news is that means is that education is where the most incredible impact can be made. We are at the heart and at the center of where a just society can be born, you know, and where the kind of social transformations that we want to see can take place. And so really the first thing is that we all take responsibility and ownership of that reality. And I think the second piece of that within the educational context is that we have to be honest and recognize that education is extremely hierarchical. It's a kind of system that makes people feel powerless within their roles and functions. And there's often a lot of red tape that I know we're all familiar with, and, you know, kind of bureaucratic structures that make it very difficult to effect speedy and radical change. And so part of what we need to do is recognize the nature of that hierarchy, but also recognize our power within that. And as long as you're living and speaking and breathing, there's something you can do. And it's really about forming the coalitions and the collective kind of working that the mayor spoke about earlier, so that we can begin to address the power structures within the system. Thirdly, and this is crucial, we have to make anti-racism and intersectional justice central to our ethos, to our mission statements, to our strategic planning, not just a footnote in the inclusion policy, not just a tokenistic, you know, discussion during Black History Month. I'm talking about every single principle, and not just a separate bullet point by itself. I'm talking about embedding it in every single element of your strategic plan and everything you do from beyond. And this really gets to what Professor Fenton was about, is really about recapturing a vision of education that is about human growth and creativity and liberation, instead of one that's focused on unthinking obedience and conformity that produces prejudice and regimentation. We really need to think at a very fundamental level, what is our education designed to do? Because if you put growth and creativity and these kinds of things at the center of the educational mission, then it's just bad practice. It's just bad education that we could have intersectionally just structures within our sector. And so making that a priority strategically is crucial. And then fourth, as we all know, and as again has been said by others today, we have to commit the appropriate time, money, and resources to making the changes that we seek. And so that means, in a very kind of basic way, treating the journey towards intersectional justice in education the way you would any other organizational change. I think one of the challenges within, when we get to talking about intersectional justice and racism, is that there's a kind of, people think there's a kind of mystical, magical, or somehow unknown set of ideas that we need to tackle these issues, when actually, if we want to move from a system that kind of reproduces inequality to one that does not, it's very much like any other plan that you would want to implement. So you need to benchmark your existing resources, determine what additional support and personnel you need, identify where your finances are going to come from, what work needs to be done, write your business case, evaluate, you know, set smart objectives, and all the things that you would do when you wanted to implement something else. Track your deliverables and ultimately hold people accountable for implementing the changes that you want to see. And fifth, you need to direct those resources in the right place, right? So that we don't have a pot of gold sitting at the end of the rainbow, right? You know, none of us, that we already have heard about the kind of sense of underinvestment in education. And so one of the things that we need to do is not default to a kind of what I describe in the report as a deficit model, as again asking African, Caribbean, and Asian descended people to parade their kind of experiences and pain and frustration. And I'm not saying that to suggest that we shouldn't seek to understand these experiences, but rather, if we take the existing literature seriously on the front end and recognize there isn't that level playing field, we know that we need to do things like make those structural changes. So whether it's transforming the curriculum or embedding anti-racism within your mission statements and strategies, as I've suggested, you know, and really understanding that to change the ethos of an organization, to change the systemic structures of an organization is a huge project. And to do that, you have to dedicate resources, right? But it's also important to say that it's a question as much of prioritizing, because the truth is, it's not that we're necessarily within the education sector going to get more money from somewhere for the programs and initiatives that address intersectional racism, it's really that we are going to have to prioritize the resources that we already have, right? And the good news is that if you have embedded anti-racism within your overall strategic plan, you will be able to prioritize those resources accordingly. And finally, from a strategic point of view, schools and wherever we are in the chain are going to have to upward manage. We're going to have to advocate and put pressure on the DFE, on Ofsted, on ITT providers, on universities, on national collection data bodies, and all the structures that dictate how you run your schools and academies to embed anti-racism and intersectional injustices within their directives and guidelines and assessment criteria, because ultimately these are the structures which shape education in this country. And even the most maverick of institutions or teachers has to toe the line to those governmental frameworks in some way. And so we have to upward manage and hold these structures responsible and accountable for really implementing the information in their own reports. I think one of the, I have to be honest, kind of depressing things that I encountered whilst preparing, writing the report that I did, is that the government itself has all this information. It has the data, we have the information. And then there would be a report about, the problems within ITT training or in education, and then a new public policy, but that one that didn't include any of the findings from their own report. And so there's a need to link up the information we know with the initiatives that we implement. So that's it for me. I think those are, like I say, I'm really addressing this at the structural level. And so I look forward to hearing all the other information from my colleagues about other things that you can do. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. Thank you very much. So much there to take on board. And as Gabriella says, what she's just been talking about are some of the findings from a report that Oasis commissioned at Gabby's report. And later, I'm going to tell you where you can find that report and download it for yourselves from Oasis website, along with a ton of other resources, including all the recordings from the talks from this morning. So you'll be able to listen to Marvin and Kevin again.